The year was 1527. England was a land in flux, perched on the edge of two worlds, the fading medieval age and the bright promise of the Renaissance. King Henry VIII ruled the throne, a man both feared and admired, whose decisions reshaped not only the politics of the realm but also the very fabric of society. In the grand halls of London, courtiers schemed for influence, fortunes rose and fell with a whisper, and families dreamed of climbing higher than their birth had allowed. Far from that glittering stage, in the rolling hills of Derbyshire, a child was born who would one day rival queens. Her name was Elizabeth Hardwicke, though history would remember her simply as Bess of Hardwicke. At the time of her birth, there was nothing to suggest greatness. She was the daughter of a modest gentry family, neither wealthy nor powerful, yet destined to carve her name into England's history. Bess's father, John Hardwicke, was a country gentleman. He owned land, yes, but not enough to mark the family among the true nobility. The Hardwickes were what one might call middling gentry, respected locally, but with little influence in the grand scheme of Tudor England. Bess's mother, Elizabeth Leake, was left widowed when her husband died, while Bess was still a young girl. Widowhood in Tudor England was not just a matter of grief, it was a struggle for survival. With a household of children and dwindling resources, the Hardwicke family could easily have slipped into obscurity. Yet, within that uncertain childhood, Bess's character began to form. She learned resilience not from books or tutors, but from watching her mother fight to keep the family afloat. Every coin spent, every field managed, every connection maintained mattered. Survival itself was an education, but Bess was not content with mere survival. Even as a child, she displayed a sharpness that startled those around her. She listened carefully to conversations about land and inheritance, absorbing the hidden rules that governed society. She studied the families around her, who prospered, who failed, and why. Where other girls might have been taught to embroider and remain silent, Bess was quietly learning the art of ambition. In the England of her youth, a woman's future was often determined by marriage. Love was seldom the question. Instead, alliances, dowries, and family connections shaped destinies. Bess saw this clearly, even as a girl. She understood, perhaps earlier than most, that marriage was not only a union of two people, it was a transaction of wealth, power, and survival. If she could not inherit power, she would marry it. This lesson became the foundation of her life. By the time she entered her teenage years, the Hardwicke family's financial situation remained fragile. Yet Bess had already begun to show the skills that would later define her. She cultivated friendships among neighboring gentry families, observed the manners of the higher classes, and carried herself with a confidence beyond her years. Even in small gatherings, she stood out. It is said that ambition often begins with a dream. For Bess, that dream was not of castles or crowns at first, but of security, a life beyond the uncertainty that had marked her childhood. She longed for stability, for wealth that could not be taken away, and for a name that would command respect. Opportunity came sooner than she expected. By the age of 15, she was married. Her first husband, Robert Barlow, was also very young, barely out of boyhood himself. Their union was less about romance and more about the promise of property and connection. Yet fate dealt Bess a cruel twist. Robert died only a year later, leaving her a widow while still in her mid-teens, though tragic. This brief marriage gave Bess her first true taste of what marriage could bring. Even in widowhood, she secured some inheritance and, more importantly, her first step into the world of landed families. Most girls, widowed so young, would have retreated back into obscurity, but Bess saw it differently. Widowhood, though painful, had opened a door. Looking back, it is easy to imagine Bess standing on the threshold of adulthood, her eyes fixed firmly on a world that had not yet noticed her. The quiet fields of Derbyshire might have seemed far from London's palaces, but in her mind, they were stepping stones. She had already glimpsed a truth that others overlooked. Wealth and power were not inherited by chance alone. They could be built, piece by piece, through determination, calculation, and the right choices. The young girl who once wandered the meadows of Hardwicke was now ready to play in the grand game of Tudor England. She had no great fortune, no powerful family backing her, and no guarantee of success. But she had something far more dangerous: ambition sharpened by hardship. Centuries later, historians would call her the woman who rivaled a queen. But in these early years, she was simply a girl who refused to accept the limits of her birth. No one could have predicted that this farmer's daughter would one day become one of the richest and most influential women in England, second only to Queen Elizabeth I. Herself. Her rise had only just begun. The year was the early 1540s. England was in turmoil. King Henry VIII's marriages and the religious upheavals of the Reformation had shaken the very foundations of society. Noble families rose and fell at dizzying speed, and fortunes could be destroyed with a single royal command. In this unstable world, a young woman from Derbyshire was quietly beginning to shape her destiny. She was no longer the child who had once played in the meadows of Hardwicke. Now in her mid-teens, Elizabeth Bess Hardwicke had already tasted both marriage and widowhood. Her first husband, Robert Barlow, died within a year of their union, leaving her with little financial gain. Yet, instead of seeing the marriage as a failure, Bess treated it as a lesson. She now understood the stakes of marriage in Tudor England, that it was not merely about survival, but about advancement. For a time, she returned to her mother's household, but her ambitions did not fade. Bess began to forge relationships with wealthier and more powerful families. Her connections gradually extended beyond Derbyshire, reaching into the broader network of England's rising gentry. She understood that if she remained confined to her family's modest estate, she would never achieve the life she envisioned. Opportunity soon presented itself in the form of Sir William Cavendish, a wealthy courtier and treasurer of the King's Chamber. Cavendish was twice widowed, considerably older than Bess, and already a father. For many young women, marrying such a man might have seemed daunting, but for Bess it was a chance, a doorway into the very heart of Tudor society. In 1547, when Bess was about 20 years old, she married William Cavendish. This marriage was a turning point. It was not only a union of two people, but a calculated alliance. Cavendish brought money, royal connections, and influence. Bess brought ambition, intelligence, and a vision for the future. Unlike many women of her time, Bess did not simply fade into the background of her husband's life. She took an active role in managing their estates, learning the intricacies of property, tenants, and income. She urged Cavendish to invest in land, particularly former monastic properties that had been seized by the crown during Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries. These investments, guided by Bess's shrewd instincts, laid the foundation of the Cavendish fortune. It was during these years that Bess began to show another side of her character. Her passion for building and furnishing. She had a keen eye for architecture, design, and luxury, and she envisioned homes not merely as places to live, but as symbols of power and status. With Cavendish's wealth, she began to realize her vision, commissioning improvements and expansions to their properties. Life in Tudor England was never without danger. Political winds shifted constantly, and Cavendish's position at court was not always secure. Yet Bess adapted quickly to the world of power. She learned how to navigate court politics, how to flatter when necessary, and when to remain silent. Her charm, intelligence, and poise made her a figure of respect among those who met her. The marriage also brought Bess something equally important: children. Over the course of her union with Cavendish, she bore 8 children, though not all survived infancy, a painful reality of the 16th century. Still, her surviving children would go on to form the foundation of powerful dynasties. thanks to the alliances and wealth that Bess so carefully secured. The death of Henry VIII in 1547 and the brief reign of his son Edward VI marked turbulent years for England. Religious conflict deepened, and noble families schemed for power. But in the midst of this upheaval, Bess remained steady. She was no longer a powerless girl. She was now the wife of a wealthy treasurer, a mother, and a woman with growing influence. The marriage to Cavendish lasted only 10 years. He died in 1557, leaving Bess a widow once again. Yet this time, the circumstances were vastly different from her first widowhood. She did not return to poverty or obscurity. Instead, she emerged as a woman of considerable means through careful management and inheritance. She became responsible for vast estates and the future of the Cavendish family. Widowhood, for most women, was a period of vulnerability, but for Bess, it was liberation. She had control over her children's futures, over lands and finances, and, perhaps most importantly, over her own choices. She was now a wealthy, independent woman, and in Tudor England, such women were rare and often formidable. By the time she was in her early 30s, Bess of Hardwicke had transformed her life. From the uncertain beginnings of a Derbyshire childhood, she had married into wealth. The year was 1557. England was once again in crisis. Queen Mary I sat on the throne, desperately trying to restore Catholicism, while the kingdom struggled with war, famine, and debt. In these uncertain times, the death of Sir William Cavendish left his 30-year-old widow Bess of Hardwicke facing the future alone. But Bess was no ordinary widow. For most women, the loss of a husband meant vulnerability. Property could be seized, children could be claimed by male guardians, and financial security could vanish overnight. Yet Bess had prepared for this moment. From the very beginning of her marriage to Cavendish, she had insisted on contracts, joint ownerships, and protections that ensured her rights as a wife and mother. It was a level of foresight rare among women of her time. When William Cavendish was laid to rest, Bess stepped forward, not as a grieving widow alone, but as the head of a family, guardian of 8 children, and the mistress of vast estates. She had inherited debts as well as wealth, but unlike many who crumbled under financial strain, Bess saw the challenge as an opportunity. Her management of the Cavendish properties was extraordinary. She restructured estates, collected rents with precision, and tightened financial oversight. Bess was not afraid to pursue debtors or to expand her holdings when the chance arose. Where others hesitated, she acted with determination. Land, she understood, was the truest form of wealth in Tudor England. It could not be lost overnight like a royal favor, nor spent away like coin. If she could secure land for her children, she could secure their future forever. But Bess's ambition did not stop with estates. She also turned her attention to alliances. As a widow of considerable means, she was now one of the most sought-after women in the kingdom. Suitors knew that a marriage to her meant access to wealth, property, and a powerful family network. Bess weighed her options carefully, for she was no longer the young girl married off at 15. This time, she would choose a husband who could elevate her further in society. It was during this period that Bess entered the service of the household of Frances Grey, Duchess of Suffolk, mother of Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen. The Grey family, though tainted by political scandal after Jane's tragic execution, remained influential. Through them, Bess gained access to court circles once again. She observed the delicate dance of nobles and courtiers, and she made valuable connections that would serve her for decades to come. Among these connections was Sir William St. Loup, captain of the Queen's Guard. Under Elizabeth I, St. Loup was a man of influence, with close ties to the new Protestant regime. For Bess, this marriage represented not just wealth, but political security. England had been rocked by Mary's Catholic policies, But with Elizabeth ascending the throne in 1558, Protestant families like the St. Louis were now in favor. By aligning herself with William St. Louis, Bess secured a place within the Queen's trusted circle. Their marriage was happy, by most accounts, and St. Louis valued Bess's intelligence. He allowed her wide control over finances and property, a freedom few husbands granted their wives. Even more importantly, he left her with an extraordinary inheritance. When he died in 1565, Bess became one of the richest widows in England. She was granted full control of his estates, bypassing his other relatives, a controversial move that led to disputes, but one that cemented her financial independence. Now in her late 30s, Bess had been widowed 3 times, but instead of diminishing her, each marriage had elevated her further. She had moved from modest Derbyshire gentry to the wealthy Cavendish fortune, and now to the St. Louis inheritance, which placed her among the elite of the realm. Yet perhaps, the most significant aspect of her marriage to St. Louis was the access it gave her to Queen Elizabeth's court. Bess became known to the Queen, and the two women shared a wary respect. Elizabeth admired Bess's intelligence and skill, but she also recognized in her a rare form of ambition, the kind of ambition that could make even a queen uneasy. By this point, Bess was more than a wealthy widow. She was a strategist, a woman who had proven that she could navigate the dangers of Tudor politics and emerge stronger after each trial. She had the loyalty of her children, the security of her estates, and the recognition of the crown. But she was not finished. Her eye was set higher still. She wanted her family to be woven into the very fabric of England's nobility, to establish dynasties that would endure long after she was gone. For this, she would need another marriage, one not only of wealth, but of title. The ambitious widow of Derbyshire, once dismissed as the daughter of minor gentry, was now in a position to rival some of the greatest names in the kingdom, and she knew exactly where her path would lead next. By the mid-1560s, Bess of Hardwicke had already defied the odds. She had been widowed 3 times, but each loss had left her wealthier, stronger, and more influential than before. Through shrewd management and carefully chosen marriages, she had risen from a modest Derbyshire background to become one of the richest women in England. Yet Bess was not finished climbing. Wealth was not enough. She wanted status, the kind of recognition that came only with a title. Her chance came in 1567, when she married George Talbot, the 6th Earl of Shrewsbury. It was her 4th and final marriage, and it would place her among the very highest ranks of English nobility. Talbot was one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, a landowner with estates spanning multiple counties, and a figure of enormous political importance. For Bess, this marriage was not just a union of 2 people, but a bold step into the elite world of earls, dukes, and royalty. This was a strategic match in every sense. To seal the bond between their families, Bess and Talbot arranged a series of marriages between their children. Her daughter married his son, his daughter married her son. Through these alliances, their families became deeply entwined. It was a dynastic move, carefully crafted to ensure that the wealth and power of both houses would remain united for generations. At first, the marriage was strong. Talbot admired Bess's intelligence and respected her abilities. He trusted her judgment in managing household affairs and even allowed her input in the handling of estates, a rare concession for a nobleman of his rank. Together, they formed a partnership that, at least in its early years, seemed destined to shape the future of England's landed aristocracy. But the union was soon tested by one of the most extraordinary responsibilities ever given to an English noble couple. In 1569, Queen Elizabeth I entrusted George Talbot with the custody of Mary, Queen of Scots, who had fled to England after being forced from her throne in Scotland. For nearly 16 years, Mary would live under Talbot's guard, moving between his estates at Tutbury Castle, Sheffield, and Wingfield. Bess, as his wife, shared in this duty. At first, The task may have seemed like an honor, a sign of the Queen's trust, but in reality, it was a burden that strained their household, drained their resources, and ultimately fractured their marriage. Mary Stuart was no ordinary prisoner. She was a queen, a woman of charisma and charm, with a claim to the English throne that made her both a guest and a threat. Keeping her required immense security, constant surveillance, and enormous expense. For years, the Talbots bore the financial weight of her captivity. Often without full reimbursement from the crown, Bess initially tolerated the presence of Mary, but as the years passed, tensions grew. Rumors circulated that Talbot grew too fond of his royal prisoner, and Bess, fiercely protective of her position, began to resent both Mary and the Queen, who had imposed this burden upon them. The marriage between Bess and Talbot, once built on partnership, began to deteriorate. Despite the personal strain, Bess continued to use her new position to advance her ambitions. She was now a countess, one of the most prestigious titles a woman in England could hold. With it came influence, visibility, and an elevated place in society. She used her title to arrange further advantageous marriages for her children, weaving her family into the fabric of the nobility. Her wealth also gave her the freedom to pursue her greatest passion, building, while her husband was consumed with the endless task of guarding Mary. Bess began commissioning grand projects. She expanded Chatsworth House, the Cavendish family seat, turning it into one of the most elegant estates in the country. Later, she would begin work on her crowning achievement, Hardwicke Hall, a house so magnificent that people would say it had more glass than wall. But within her marriage, harmony gave way to discord. Talbot grew weary under the strain of his duty and the constant suspicion of the crown. Bess, determined and uncompromising, clashed with him frequently. Their once strong alliance turned bitter, marked by disputes over money, politics, and the presence of Mary. Eventually, the couple became estranged, living separately, despite remaining legally bound. Yet even in this personal turmoil, Bess emerged unshaken. If anything, the collapse of her marriage reinforced what she had always known. In Tudor England, survival depended not on affection, but on strategy. She had married Talbot for status, and she had achieved it. The title of Countess of Shrewsbury would remain hers, no matter the state of her relationship. By the late 1570s, Bess was firmly established as one of the most powerful women in the realm. She was not only wealthy, but titled, with family connections stretching across the nobility. Her children and grandchildren were rising through advantageous. By the early 1550s, the winds of power in England shifted yet again. Edward VI, Henry VIII's frail son, had died, leaving the throne in turmoil. Lady Jane Grey reigned for 9 short days before being swept aside by the powerful Mary Tudor. The realm braced itself for a queen who would bring back Catholic rule, and in the midst of these upheavals, Bess Hardwicke quietly returned to the hills of Derbyshire. She was still young, not yet 30, but already twice widowed, a woman who had known both struggle and fortune. Her first husband, Robert Barlow, had given her little but a lesson in survival. Her second, Sir William Cavendish, had left her with a sprawling family and the foundations of real wealth. Now, in Derbyshire, Bess began to weave the threads of her next chapter, one that would transform her from a wealthy widow into a force of her own making. The countryside of Derbyshire was both familiar and alien to her now. Once, she had been a farmer's daughter roaming these same fields, dreaming of silk gowns and courtly banquets. Now, she returned, not as a dependent girl, but as Lady Cavendish, mistress of lands, mother to 6 children, and a widow with powerful connections. Her arrival stirred whispers among the local gentry. She was no longer simply Bess Hardwicke, of Hardwicke. She was a woman to be reckoned with. In the great hall of her Derbyshire home, tapestries and fine furniture spoke of her husband's wealth. Yet it was Bess's presence that gave the place its life. She carried herself with a quiet authority, her eyes sharp, her manner deliberate. She was not one to waste either coin or opportunity. For Bess, every decision was a step toward securing her children's future, and her own. Her 6 daughters and sons were her first concern. Each represented a chance to forge alliances, to bind her name with families of greater influence. She studied the noble families of England as a strategist might study a battlefield. The Cavendishes, with their new money and estates, needed stronger roots among the nobility. Bess was determined to provide them. One story tells of how she would sit at a heavy oak table, parchment spread before her, calculating dowries and surveying the marriages of England's most powerful families. She knew that in Tudor England, bloodlines were as valuable as gold. A carefully arranged marriage could open doors to court, to patronage, to influence that no mere inheritance could buy. It was here that her brilliance as a matchmaker first began to shine. She approached the matter not with sentiment, but with precision. Her daughters, she vowed, would not be wasted on minor landowners. They would marry well, and through them, the name Cavendish and Hardwicke would rise. But Derbyshire was not just a place of family planning. It was also the stage where Bess's passion for building began to flourish. She had tasted life at court, seen the grand houses of nobles and courtiers, and she understood the power of architecture. A great house was not merely a residence, it was a statement. It proclaimed wealth, stability, and ambition carved into stone. At Chatsworth, the Cavendish seat, Bess began to pour her energy into renovations. She oversaw the construction with a sharp eye, choosing designs and furnishings that reflected not only luxury, but also her own taste for elegance. Workers and craftsmen knew her as a woman who demanded perfection, a mistress who noticed every detail, from the cut of the stone to the weave of the hangings. This was not a lady who idly signed accounts while men handled her affairs. Bess walked the grounds, inspected the masons' progress, and negotiated with suppliers herself. She was known to drive hard bargains, insisting on fair prices, but refusing to settle for anything less than excellence. In time, her reputation as a formidable builder would grow a passion that would define her legacy in the years to come. Yet behind her industry and ambition lay a woman who understood loss. Her second husband, Sir William, had died suddenly, leaving her not only with children to raise, but also debts to settle. His estates, though vast, had been burdened by financial obligations. Bess did not flinch. She tightened the household accounts, cut waste, and turned her formidable mind to restoring order. Every coin saved is a brick in the future, she is said to have remarked once, and indeed, she treated money not as treasure to be hoarded but as a tool, one that, if used wisely, could construct dynasties. The neighbors, watching from their manors and halls, marveled at her resolve. Many widows in her position might have retreated into quiet mourning, relying on male relatives to manage their estates, but not Bess. She stood firm, a figure of determination in the storm of Tudor politics. Her gaze fixed firmly on the horizon. Her time in Derbyshire was also a return to her roots. She visited Hardwicke village, where she had been born, and saw the old house of her childhood. The contrast was stark, from a modest home to the grand estates she now commanded. Yet rather than forget her origins, she embraced them. Hardwicke was where her journey had begun, and one day it would become the heart of her legacy. Local villagers saw her as both distant and familiar, a woman of immense power, yet one who had risen from among them. To the poor, she offered employment on her building projects. To the gentry, she extended cautious alliances. She understood that reputation was as vital as wealth. A single misstep could weaken her standing. In these years, Bess transformed. No longer just the wife of Sir William Cavendish, she became a power in her own right. Her children were her pawns on the board of nobility, her estates the foundation of her growing empire, and her building projects the symbols of her ambition. But she was not content. Her gaze reached beyond Derbyshire's hills, toward the courts of queens and the great halls of England. She had tasted power, and she hungered for more. As the country trembled under Queen Mary's reign, and whispers of rebellion spread, Bess plotted her next move. She would marry again, not for comfort or love, but for advancement. Each step she had taken from the fields of Hardwicke to the halls of Chatsworth had been leading her here, and so, in the quiet countryside of Derbyshire, a widow with 6 children and iron determination, prepared to climb higher still. The world would soon learn that Bess of Hardwicke was far from finished. Her rise had only just begun. By the early 1560s, Bess's fortunes were already dazzling, yet her next chapter would thrust her into the heart of England's most dangerous drama, the fate of Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1568. Mary fled Scotland after being forced to abdicate her throne. Seeking safety, she crossed into England and into the hands of Elizabeth I. To some, Mary was a cousin and a queen in distress. To others, she was a threat, a Catholic rival with a strong claim to the English throne. Elizabeth I faced a dilemma. She could not allow Mary to roam free and stir rebellion, nor could she execute her outright without angering Europe. The solution was imprisonment, but not in a dungeon. Instead, Mary was to be placed in the custody of trusted nobles, and so fate brought her to George Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, Bess's powerful husband. For nearly 15 years, Mary lived under their watch. The Shrewsbury household became both a gilded cage and a political powder keg. At first, Bess tried to show courtesy. She admired Mary's grace, her fluent languages, her regal bearing, but soon admiration turned to unease. Housing a queen was ruinously expensive. Mary insisted on servants, fine clothes, music, and letters. The costs mounted, and Elizabeth's government was slow to repay. George Talbot, proud and dutiful, bore the weight, but Bess, who counted every penny, grew resentful. Tensions deepened. Rumors swirled that Mary had charmed George with her beauty and sorrow. Letters from the time whispered that Bess accused her husband of being too close to the captive queen. Whether jealousy or truth, the suspicion poisoned their marriage. Meanwhile, the danger grew beyond their walls. Catholics across Europe plotted to free Mary and place her on England's throne. Every knock at the castle gates, every stranger on the road, could be an assassin or spy. Guards were doubled. Walls echoed with mistrust. For Bess, the strain was unbearable. She had built her life on ambition and order, yet Mary's presence brought chaos, division, and fear. Even her partnership with George, once strong, crumbled under the burden. Their quarrels became legendary, reported even to Elizabeth herself. Still, Bess endured. She managed the estates, the servants, the endless expenses. She guarded her wealth fiercely, ensuring her children's inheritances would remain secure despite the turmoil. If Elizabeth's government forgot to reimburse them, Bess did not. She documented every cost, every debt owed. Years dragged on. Mary wept, prayed, and schemed within the Shrewsbury halls. George aged, wearied by duty, and Bess, hardened by resentment, turned her energy elsewhere towards her children and the future dynasties she was building through their marriages. By the late 1580s, Elizabeth had grown weary of the Mary question. The captive queen was moved elsewhere, eventually to Fotheringay, where her fate would be sealed with the axe. For the Shrewsburys, the burden was lifted, but the scars remained. The years of guarding Mary had left Bess's marriage shattered. She and George lived apart, their once great alliance consumed by suspicion and bitterness. Yet Bess emerged, not broken, but stronger. She had endured one of the most perilous assignments in England and survived with her fortune and ambition intact. The lesson was clear. Queens might rise and fall, but Bess of Hardwicke would endure. And while Mary's head would roll on the scaffold, Bess's halls of stone would rise ever higher. By the time Mary, Queen of Scots, was removed from their custody, Bess of Hardwicke and her husband, George Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, were no longer the strong, united force they had once been. Their marriage, which had begun as a glittering union of wealth and power, now bore the weight of jealousy, suspicion, and bitter quarrels. At the heart of the discord lay Mary herself. The years of housing the Scottish Queen had been ruinously expensive, and while Elizabeth's government promised repayment, it rarely came on time. George, proud and loyal, paid for much of Mary's upkeep out of his own pocket, but Bess, practical, sharp-eyed, and fiercely protective of her wealth, resented every coin that vanished. To her, it was as if Elizabeth had sent Mary not only as a prisoner, but as a financial drain meant to punish them both. Worse still, rumors swirled in every corner of England that George had grown too fond of the Scottish Queen. Servants whispered that he lingered too long in her chambers, that his tone softened when he addressed her. To Bess, who had built her life on vigilance and control, the mere possibility was intolerable. She accused her husband of betrayal, not only of her, but of Elizabeth herself. Their quarrels grew so heated that even Elizabeth heard of them. The Queen, who relied on the Shrewsburys to keep Mary contained, was furious at the disorder. Letters from Elizabeth reveal her sharp tone. She scolded both George and Bess for their squabbling and reminded them of their duties. But the damage was already done. The couple who had once been admired for their partnership now lived in open hostility. George, weary and insulted by Bess's accusations, withdrew more and more from her company. Bess, never one to bow her head, focused instead on her children and her estates. She poured her energy into ensuring her sons and daughters married into powerful families, creating alliances that would secure her legacy long after her own life ended. The split between Bess and George was not merely personal, it was political. As tensions over religion and succession tightened in England, every noble alliance mattered. Bess aligned herself with her children and their futures, while George remained loyal to the crown. Despite his mounting debts and declining health, the couple's estrangement became the talk of the realm. In the glittering courts and among the gossiping servants, it was said that Bess had grown so powerful and independent that she no longer needed her husband. For a Tudor woman, such independence was remarkable, even dangerous. Yet Bess seemed unshaken by the scandal. The cracks in their marriage also symbolized a larger truth about Tudor England. Alliances built on wealth and ambition could fracture under the relentless pressures of politics and suspicion. The Shrewsburys had once been a formidable force, but with Mary at the center of their disputes, their unity had dissolved. By the late 1580s, George Talbot's health was failing though. Still an earl, he was worn down by years of service, quarrels, and financial ruin. Bess, meanwhile, continued to rise. She had learned that true survival in Tudor England did not come from a husband's strength, but from her own cunning, her own estates, and her unyielding will. When George finally died in 1590, Bess was already prepared. She had secured her children's futures, amassed lands, and built homes that would outshine the crumbling ruins of her marriage. While the Earl was buried with his ancestors, Bess of Hardwicke turned her gaze to the future, a future where her name, not George's, would echo across history. The marriage that had once promised to make her secure had instead taught her a harsher lesson. In a world ruled by queens and kings, even the strongest alliances could shatter, but Bess, unlike so many others, would not be undone by it. Instead, she would rise from the ruins, more determined than ever to leave behind something unshakable. And so, as the 1590s dawned, Bess began the greatest building project of her life, a monument not just of stone, but of ambition, vision, and defiance. In the wake of her husband's death in 1590, Bess of Hardwicke stood at a crossroads. She was no longer the wife of an earl, no longer bound to the quarrels that had once consumed her marriage. Instead, she was free free to shape her destiny, her wealth, and most importantly, her legacy. For Bess, this meant turning stone, glass, and vision into a monument that would outlast kings and queens. That monument was Hardwicke Hall, perched high on a hilltop in Derbyshire. The site commanded sweeping views of the countryside, a statement of dominance and control. From the very beginning, Bess envisioned not merely a house, but a palace that would proclaim her triumph over the struggles of her past. And in true Bess fashion, she spared no expense. Hardwicke Hall was unlike anything England had seen before. Its design broke with the heavy, defensive architecture of the medieval age. Instead of thick walls and narrow slits for protection, it embraced light, openness, and elegance. This shift reflected not only the times, but also Bess's own ambition. She wanted the world to see her power, not hide it. The most striking feature was the glass. In Tudor England, glass was an extraordinary luxury, expensive, rare, and reserved only for the wealthiest. Yet Bess filled her new home with it. Vast windows stretched across every facade, so much so that a popular rhyme declared, "Hardwicke Hall, more glass than wall." This was no exaggeration. Sunlight streamed through enormous panes, illuminating gilded ceilings, polished wood, and fine tapestries that adorned the halls. To any visitor, Hardwicke was dazzling, a palace of light that stood as proof of Bess's fortune. But the glass also carried a message. In a world where women were expected to be modest and hidden, Bess chose transparency and spectacle. She wanted her wealth and taste to be on display for all to see. Hardwicke was not just her home. It was a declaration of independence. At the roofline, she had her initials carved boldly into stone. E.'s Elizabeth Shrewsbury. No other noblewoman of her age dared to stamp her identity so prominently on a building. For Bess, it was her way of inscribing herself into history, ensuring her name could never be erased. Inside, the rooms reflected her passions. She furnished them with fine tapestries from Flanders, rare carpets from the East, and lavish portraits that told the story of her family's rise. The long gallery, stretching over 160 feet, was filled with art and light, a space designed for visitors to marvel at her power. Guests would walk its length in awe, surrounded by the riches of the world. Hardwicke Hall was not just for show. It also served as the hub of Bess's dynasty. She had carefully arranged marriages for her children, securing alliances with some of the greatest families in England. Her descendants included the Cavendishes, who would go on to become the Dukes of Devonshire, one of the most enduring aristocratic houses in Britain. Hardwicke was the heart of this legacy, a physical reminder that Bess had built not only wealth, but a dynasty. What makes Hardwicke even more remarkable is that Bess oversaw its creation in her 70s. While many women of her age retreated into quiet retirement, she embraced one of the most ambitious projects of her life. It was the ultimate proof of her resilience. Despite scandal, despite broken marriages, despite whispers of impropriety, she had risen to a level of power few women or men ever achieved. Visitors to Hardwicke were stunned by what they saw. Courtiers, nobles, and even Elizabeth I herself recognized it as a marvel of the age. Yet the Queen could not fail to notice the irony. Here was another Elizabeth, Elizabeth Shrewsbury, commanding attention, wealth, and loyalty in a way that rivaled her own. By the time Hardwicke Hall was complete, Bess had cemented her place in history. The palace was more than stone and glass. It was a story in architecture, a story of a woman who had married wisely, fought fiercely, and refused to be silenced. A story of survival in a world that offered little mercy to ambitious women. Even now, centuries later, Hardwicke Hall stands proud, its vast windows glittering in the sunlight, its walls echoing with the life Bess once filled them with. It remains her greatest triumph, a living monument to a woman who rose from minor gentry to one of the most powerful figures of Tudor England. For Bess, Hardwicke was not simply a home. It was her immortality. By the time the towers of Hardwicke Hall rose proudly above the Derbyshire hills, Bess of Hardwicke was already an old woman. She had lived through the reigns of 4 monarchs, had weathered political storms, survived scandals, and emerged as one of the wealthiest women in England. Yet even as she approached her 80s, Bess was not content to fade quietly into history. Her will, her energy, and her sharp mind remained as unyielding as ever. But age has a way of softening even the hardest of edges. As the years wore on, Bess turned increasingly inward. Her thoughts lingered on her legacy, not just the stone and glass of Hardwicke, but the bloodline she had so carefully cultivated. She had spent decades arranging advantageous marriages for her children, weaving alliances that would secure her family's power long after she was gone, and indeed, she succeeded. Her descendants, the Cavendishes, were rising swiftly on their way to becoming dukes and statesmen. Bess knew her dynasty was safe. Yet for all her triumphs, she was also haunted by memories of conflict. Her bitter quarrels with her last husband, George Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, had left scars that never fully healed. The man who had once been her partner in ambition had become her enemy in old age. Though she outlived him, the shadow of their broken marriage remained. In her later years, Bess grew increasingly controlling. She kept a tight grip on her household, sometimes to the frustration of her children and servants. But beneath the iron discipline lay a fear of losing what she had fought so hard to gain. She had risen from obscurity to the heights of power, and she knew better than anyone how easily fortune could be lost. Her relationship with Mary, Queen of Scots, also lingered in memory. For over 15 years, Mary had been held prisoner in Bess's homes, a constant source of tension. Their time together had been fraught. Friendship one moment, bitter rivalry the next. Bess could never forget that within her walls, history had shifted. Mary's fate had been sealed, and Bess had stood close enough to feel the ripple of a queen's downfall. By the turn of the 17th century, Bess was nearly 80, an astonishing age for her time. Frail in body, but sharp in mind, she continued to rule her estates with precision. Visitors still came to marvel at Hardwicke Hall, and Bess made sure her presence was felt in every detail. Her initials ES, carved proudly into the stone, reminded all who entered that this was her world, her achievement. On February 13, 1608, Bess of Hardwicke breathed her last. She was 81 years old, one of the longest-lived women of her age. The news of her death spread across England, marking the end of an extraordinary life. From the modest daughter of a Derbyshire gentleman, she had risen to become the second wealthiest woman in the kingdom, second only to Queen Elizabeth I herself. She was laid to rest in All Saints Cathedral, Derby, in a grand tomb she had commissioned for herself years before. The monument bore her likeness in alabaster, dressed in noble robes, her hands clasped in prayer, a lasting symbol of her dignity and ambition. Yet, perhaps, Bess's true monument was not her tomb, but Hardwicke Hall. Centuries later, the glass still glitters in the sunlight, the walls still stand strong, and her name is still carved proudly into the stone. Every visitor who passes through its vast halls walks in the shadow of a woman who refused to be forgotten. Bess's story is one of determination, resilience, and vision. In an age when women were expected to be silent, she spoke through action. In a society that sought to limit her, she expanded her world through marriage, wealth, and architecture. Her life was proof that even in the rigid hierarchy of Tudor England, ambition could carve its own destiny. As the centuries passed, her descendants carried her legacy forward, dukes, duchesses, and politicians who owed their fortunes to the woman who had built the foundation stone by stone. Her bloodline stretched across the great houses of England, her story whispered in the halls of power. And so, the girl from Derbyshire, who began with nothing but determination, left behind a name etched into history, Bess of Hardwicke, the woman who built a palace of glass and a dynasty of stone. More than 4 centuries have passed since Bess of Hardwicke drew her last breath in 1608, yet her presence lingers, etched into stone, written into lineage, and whispered in the very fabric of English history. Unlike many figures of her age, Bess was never a queen, never crowned, nor anointed. Yet she carved a throne of her own, a throne built not of royal decree, but of resilience, wealth, and vision. Her greatest monument remains Hardwicke Hall. Visitors who arrive at the grand estate still feel the weight of her ambition. The vast walls, crowned with her initials, E's for Elizabeth Shrewsbury, are more than decoration. They are a statement, a reminder that Bess was not merely a caretaker of wealth but its architect. Hardwicke, with its glittering windows, was centuries ahead of its time. It embodied not just luxury, but defiance. In an age of uncertainty, she dared to build something eternal. Yet Hardwicke is only part of her story. Her bloodline spread through the aristocracy like veins of gold and stone. The Cavendish dynasty, born from her foresight, would rise to become one of the most powerful families in England. From dukes of Devonshire to statesmen, writers, and patrons of the arts, Bess's descendants helped shape the cultural and political landscape of Britain. Even today, traces of her ambition echo through her lineage. What makes Bess remarkable is not just what she built, but when she built it. The 16th century was a man's world, where women were expected to remain in the shadows of their husbands. Yet Bess did not hide. She married strategically, outlived 4 husbands, and turned each alliance into a stepping stone toward greater influence. Where others accepted fate, she bent it. Where others obeyed, she negotiated. But her legacy is not without shadow. Her life was marked by quarrels, broken alliances, and relentless ambition. Some remembered her as domineering, controlling, even ruthless. Yet perhaps that was the price of survival in an unforgiving age. To endure, she had to be harder than the stone she built with in the centuries since. Bess of Hardwicke has come to embody the paradox of power, both admired and feared, remembered as a builder and as a fighter. Her story has been retold in novels, histories, and documentaries, each time rekindling the question, was she a product of her age or far ahead of it? Stand in Hardwicke's great hall on a quiet evening, and you can almost hear the echoes of her world, the flicker of candlelight against vast glass windows, the murmur of servants, the measured footsteps of a woman who ruled not with a crown, but with determination. Bess's true legacy lies not only in her descendants or her estates, but in the lesson her life teaches, that power is not always inherited. Sometimes it is built, stone by stone, choice by choice, and so history remembers her not as a queen, but as something rarer, a woman who forged her destiny in an age that tried to deny her one. Bess of Hardwicke, the builder of dynasties, the mistress of glass and stone, the woman who refused to be forgotten.